Part 4. Final Days. You are filled with anguish for the suffering of others, and no one's grief has ever passed you by. You are relentless only to yourself, forever cold and pitiless. But if only you could look upon your own sadness from a distance, just once with a loving soul, oh, how you would pity yourself, how sadly you would weep. Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna Romanova, poem dedicated to her mother, April 23, 1917. Chapter 14. Survivors of a Shipwreck. March through August 1917. What to tell the children. On March 21st, the day before Nicholas returned to Tsarskoye Selo, Alexandra summoned Pierre Gilliard to her drawing room. The children had to be told about the abdication. Would the tutor explain to Alexei? Gilliard said he would. "I am going to tell the girls myself," said the empress. Calm but pale, she climbed the stairs to their sick room. What she said is not known, but the news caused them all to burst into tears. Across the hall, Pierre Gilliard sat beside Alexei. He began by telling the 12-year-old boy that his father would never be returning to Stavka. "Why?" asked Alexei. "Your father does not want to be commander-in-chief any more," replied Gilliard. Then he added, "You know, your father does not want to be Tsar any more." "What? Why?" cried Alexei. "He is very tired and has had a lot of trouble lately," answered the tutor. Alexei struggled to understand. "But who is going to be Tsar then?" "I don't know," answered Gilliard. "Perhaps nobody now." "But if there isn't a Tsar," said Alexei, fidgeting beneath his blankets, "who's going to govern Russia?" Gilliard explained about the provisional government. What he didn't tell Alexei was that they were all prisoners of the new government. Just that morning, the entire family had been placed under house arrest. Arrested. Their arrest was purely for security reasons. A representative of the provisional government, General L.G. Kornilov, had explained to Alexandra earlier that day. It was the only way to protect her and the children from the angry mobs. As for Nicholas, he was headed home as they spoke, accompanied, for safety's sake, by an armed guard. Once back at the palace, he too would be placed under house arrest. It was the government's plan, Kornilov continued, to send the whole family to England as soon as the children's health improved. In the meantime, they would all remain together under guard at Tsarskoye Selo. After speaking with Alexandra, General Kornilov dismissed the few troops still remaining at the palace. He replaced them with soldiers faithful to the new regime. Then he spoke with the servants and courtiers. They too should leave, he advised, otherwise they would be placed under house arrest with the imperial family. His words sent most people scurrying for the door, but nearly 100 of the more than 500 who had worked at the palace, ladies-in-waiting, valets, grooms, cooks, tutors, maids, and footmen, remained. This included the Empress's friend, Anna Vrubova, Pierre Gilliard, and the devoted Dr. Botkin. They were, noted Anna, like survivors of a shipwreck. Not long afterward, soldiers of the provisional government closed and locked the high iron fence surrounding the imperial park. In the palace, all entrances except the kitchen and front door were sealed shut. Sentries were posted in the hallways, and all letters going in and out of the palace were examined. Use of the telephone and telegraph was prohibited. No longer was there the coming and going of the outside world, recalled one courtier. The pulse of life had stopped. Welcome home, Nicholas. March 22nd dawned bitter, cold, and overcast. Nerves on edge, Alexandra sat beside Alexei's bed, whispering prayers and watching the clock. Every so often, the still recuperating boy called out the minutes until Papa arrived. Finally, there came the crunch of tires on the ice-crusted driveway. Minutes later, the door to the family's private rooms flew open. "His Majesty the Emperor," announced the family's faithful butler, refusing to acknowledge recent events. Then Nicholas pounded up the stairs. Alexandra gave a little squeal as she leaped from her chair to meet him. Together at last, husband and wife clung to one another, tears streaming. Alexandra reassured him of her love. "My beloved soul, of my soul, I wholly understand your action. O my hero." And Nicholas broke down, recalled Anna Vrubova. He sobbed like a child on the breast of his wife. Changes. Silver strands now streaked 48-year-old Nicholas's beard, and dark shadows circled his blue eyes. And yet, to those around him, he acted like a schoolboy on vacation, walking, sawing wood, breaking ice. This was how the former Tsar filled his days. And he felt invigorated. No more meetings with ministers, no more war reports to read or documents to sign. The only thing he admitted to missing about his old life was visiting with his mother and sisters. Otherwise, he reveled in spending time with his family and having plenty of hours to read for my own pleasure. When told they might be imprisoned at Tsarskoye Selo for several months, he replied, "A pleasant thought." 44-year-old Alexandra found life less pleasant. She spent most of her days on her sofa. Whatever glue had been holding her together since the start of the war seemed to vanish overnight. Now the family had the sickly Alexandra back. Her features suddenly aged and gaunt, her hair almost completely gray. She constantly grumbled about the hardships imposed on the family. In truth, changes in their material lifestyle were few. Footmen, in elaborate livery, still bowed and served meals. Expensive wines from the imperial cellar still appeared on the table. Maids still came to help her change into lace gowns and lengths of pearls. It was the mental strain Alexandra found intolerable. Suddenly she was a prisoner in her own home, with parts of the palace and its grounds completely off limits. Far worse were the family's walks. For a few hours each day the Romanovs were allowed outside, but every afternoon, just before they stepped out, angry crowds gathered along the iron fence. They shouted insults and obscenities. Some even hurled sticks and clods of dirt. The soldiers did little to stop this. Not long ago, just a glimpse of the Tsar would have sent them to their knees, but years of hardship had left them with little sympathy for Nicholas. Too many hard, terrible things had been connected in the past with his name, explained one soldier. One could hardly blame them for their gaping and mocking. Sometimes they went even further, poking him in the back with their bayonets, and turning rudely away when he offered to shake hands. Once a soldier even struck a rifle into the spokes of his bicycle as he pedaled past. The Tsar flew over the handlebars, crashing to the ground. He managed to accept it all without complaint. The soldiers targeted the others, too. They snatched away Alexei's toy rifle, told rude jokes about Alexandra within her earshot, and made fun of the way the girls spoke. "What an appetizing book you have in your hand," one soldier drawled in imitation of Anastasia, who was overheard complaining about lunch. "One is tempted to eat it." At first these incidents humiliated Alexandra and her children, but Nicholas helped them get over it by laughing at his new title. "Don't call me a Tsar any more," he would joke. "I am only an X." Soon the rest of the family began using the expression. One day, when an overcooked ham was placed on the lunch table, Nicholas declared, "Well, this may have once been a ham, but now it's nothing but an X-ham." Everyone, even Alexandra, giggled. And so slowly the empress began to accept her fate. "It is necessary to look more calmly on everything," she said 3 months after her husband's abdication. "What is to be done? God has sent us such trials. Evidently he thinks we are prepared for it. It is a sort of examination to prove we are ready for his grace." Lenin's return. Just before midnight, on April 16, 1917, a train pulled into Petrograd's Finland station. In the waiting area, hundreds of workers and soldiers buzzed with excitement. After 12 years in exile, Vladimir Lenin was coming home. He'd been following events in Russia closely. "It's staggering," he'd exclaimed when he learned of Nicholas's abdication. "It's so incredibly unexpected." With the Tsar gone, Lenin believed now was the time for the Soviet to finally seize power. It took 6 weeks and lots of political wrangling for Lenin to cross the war zone from Switzerland, but at long last he arrived, his well-tailored wool coat and formal felt hat contrasting sharply with the workers' gray tunics. Catching sight of him, the crowd cheered as a military band struck up a revolutionary anthem. "We renounce the old world, we shake its dust off our feet, and we don't need a golden idol, and we despise the Tsarist devil." Hurrying out into the station square, where even more workers waited, Lenin climbed onto the hood of an armored car. He declared the war a shameless imperialist slaughter, and called the provisional government who still supported the war capitalist pirates, full of lies and frauds. Bolsheviks should not, he shouted, support in any way the new government. The crowd cheered. But just because Lenin had been greeted as a returning hero did not mean the Petrograd Soviet, the majority of whom were more moderate Mensheviks, agreed with him. Only 2 months earlier, it had agreed to support the provisional government. Thus, many were flabbergasted when Lenin appeared before the Soviet's members the morning after his arrival and demanded an immediate overthrow of the provisional government. "We don't need any parliamentary republic," Lenin shouted. "We don't need any rich man's democracy. We don't need any government but the Soviet of worker and soldiers." Boos and whistles met his words. "That is raving," hollered one listener. "That is the raving of a lunatic." It seemed Lenin, who had lived comfortably in Europe, did not understand how hard they'd struggled to reach this place. "He is," snorted one member, "a hopeless failure." But Lenin, who loved a fight, now launched what he called his drive to power. Through the spring and summer of 1917, he appeared before Petrograd crowds, giving passionate speeches. Even though he could not pronounce his R's, his use of easy slogans and repetition made his message memorable. "Bread, peace, land, and all power to the Soviets. That is what we want. That is what we deserve. Bread, peace, land, and all power to the Soviets." Thumbs shoved under his armpits, swaying back and forth to the rhythm of his staccato words, Lenin possessed, said a listener, a curious, hypnotic power. His message was strengthened by the continued ineffectiveness of the provisional government. The cost of living had continued to skyrocket, food supplies remained scarce, and no steps had been taken to help the peasants toward their heart's desire of more land. The war, citizens believed, was to blame for all these problems, so why weren't their new leaders doing something about the conflict? Could those rich upper-class ministers in the cabinet be continuing the war for their own purpose? Mistrust growing, the Petrograd Soviet demanded to know the government's war policy. In early April, leaders responded with their declaration on war aims. Russia's role in the conflict, the document claimed, would be purely defensive. She would protect her borders and nothing more. But the Soviet was not entirely assured. It insisted the provisional government send a diplomatic note to their allies declaring the same. Government leaders agreed. But just weeks later, on May 3rd, newspapers defiantly published the contents of that note, and it contradicted what leaders had told the Soviet. Instead, the government's foreign minister, P.N. Milyukov, had assured allies that Russia would go on fighting Germany to the bitter end. The next day, mass demonstrations broke out in Petrograd and Moscow. Angry mobs carrying guns and banners denounced the foreign minister. They declared the government deceitful and hypocritical. They demanded change. To calm the chaos, Milyukov quickly resigned, but it wasn't enough. The people demanded more representation in the new government. After a long and heated debate, the Petrograd Soviet decided, much to Bolshevik members' disgust, to participate in the provisional government. 5 moderate members of the Soviet now joined the reorganized ministry. But the people's trust in their government was evaporating. By midsummer 1917, Bolshevik slogans began to resonate with many Soviet members. Recalled one Soviet member, Lenin was followed unquestioningly as the Bolsheviks' chosen leader, a man of iron will and indomitable energy, capable of instilling fanatical faith in the movement and the cause. Spring days. In May, as Lenin fanned the flames of insurrection against the provisional government, Nicholas and his children planted a vegetable garden. Happily, they moved sod, turned soil, and poked seeds into muddy furrows. Their clothing grew dirt-streaked and their fingernails turned black, but they didn't care. Working in the sunshine was bliss, and incredibly, some soldiers even offered to help. A few weeks of standing over the Romanovs, they began to see them as ordinary people. Soon, wrote Gilliard in his diary, several guards even came to help us. Hatred softening, they laid down their rifles and picked up hoes. Before long, the family was chatting with the soldiers as they all weeded and tilled together. Enter Kerensky. While the Romanovs tended their cabbages, the provisional government wrestled with the question of what to do with the family. At first, everyone believed they would be sent to England. Not only was King George V related to Nicholas and Alexandra, he was first cousin to both of them. He had even offered them refuge in his country. That spring, however, King George received thousands of letters from incensed British citizens. With the war against Germany and Austria still raging, they saw German-born Alexandra as an enemy. Worried that public opinion might boil over as it had in Russia, King George withdrew his invitation. The next best thing to do, decided Alexander Kerensky, was to move the Romanovs someplace far from Petrograd. Just an hour's car ride away, the capital seethed with angry citizens. Seeking revenge, many demanded the family be imprisoned in the small dark cells of the Peter and Paul fortress. Shouts of, to the palace, were repeatedly heard in the streets. Kerensky feared a vengeful mob might attack the family. The city's atmosphere grew even more dangerous in July 1917, when the provisional government decided to launch a military offensive against the Austrians. It had been 2 years since the Russian army had gone on the attack. Morale among the soldiers had never been lower. Mass desertions continued, and many refused to fight. The provisional government, however, was encouraged by the United States' entry into the war. This powerful new ally, they hoped, would somehow help Russia defeat Germany. Kerensky, who had recently become Minister of War, toured the front, making eloquent speeches to rally the troops. The offensive began in early July and soon turned into a rout, not for the Austrians and the Germans who helped them, but for the Russians, as hundreds of thousands of peasant soldiers were killed. Passionate anti-war feelings erupted. In Petrograd, 500,000 people took to the streets on July 16th and 17th. "Down with the war," they shouted. "Down with the provisional government." Among them marched 20,000 sailors, many of them Bolsheviks, armed with rifles and revolvers. Eager for instructions from the man whom they considered their leader, they headed to Lenin's house. If he approved, they intended to march on the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was now headquartered, round up the ministers, and proclaim Soviet power. But when they arrived, Lenin refused to even speak to them. Finally persuaded to say a few words, he stepped onto the balcony and mumbled briefly about the future of Soviet power. Why didn't he fire up the crowds to topple the government? No one knows for sure. Minutes later, the discouraged sailors marched away. That's when soldiers of the provisional government began firing on them from rooftops and the upper windows of buildings. When it was over, hundreds of people lay dead or wounded. Recalled one witness, "It is clear that the crowds on the street had absolutely no idea of what they were doing. It was all a nightmare. Nobody knew the aims of the uprising or its leaders. Were there any leaders at all? I doubt it." This uprising convinced Kerensky that the imperial family needed to be moved immediately. "The Bolsheviks are after me," he told Nicholas, "and then will be after you." But where could the family live safely? Nicholas and Alexandra wanted to be sent to their palace in the Crimea, but Kerensky knew this was impossible. Their train would have to pass through central Russia, where angry peasants were burning down manor houses and killing landowners. After much thought, Kerensky picked a quiet river town called Tobolsk in western Siberia. "I chose Tobolsk because it was an out-and-out backwater," Kerensky later wrote, with a population which was prosperous and contented. In addition, the climate was excellent, and the town boasted a very passable governor's residence where the family could live with some measure of comfort. On August 11th, Kerensky visited Tsarskoye Selo. "Start packing," he told the royal couple. "Be prepared to leave within a few days." "Where are we going?" asked Alexandra. "For your safety, it must remain a secret," replied Kerensky. Kerensky kept his secret from almost everyone else, too. Only 5 or 6 men in all of Petrograd knew about it, he later wrote. "I made all the plans to move the family myself." First, he handpicked the men who would accompany the family and act as guards once they reached their destination. Loyal men who would follow Kerensky's orders to the letter. "Behave like gentlemen, not like cads," he advised them. "Remember, Nicholas is a former emperor, and neither he nor his family must suffer any hardships." Next, he made the travel arrangements. Knowing he could not transport the family in their easily recognizable blue imperial train, he had an ordinary one fitted out with Japanese flags and placards that read "Japanese Red Cross Mission." Kerensky hoped this disguise would reduce the chances of the family being recognized and captured. Beyond the palace gates, the Tsar's surprise party. In the summer of 1917, American journalist Albert Rise Williams was traveling across Siberia when his train came to an abrupt stop. In his book, Through the Russian Revolution, he reported what happened next. Suddenly, from behind a snowbank, a figure shoots up and comes running violently for the train. From other snow piles and bushes and from the far horizon, more and more figures keep emerging until the whole plain is dotted with men racing headlong for the train, carrying guns and grenades. They are a harsh, determined lot. Many of them are grimy, nearly black. All of them have black looks for the train. I thrust my head out the train window and addressed their leader. "Where did all these men suddenly spring from? Why is the train held up?" He replied, laughing, "These men are miners from the great coal mines less than half a mile away, and peasants from the village. Thousands more will be along directly. We intend to take off of it the Tsar and the royal family." "Tsar and royal family? On this train? Here?" I shouted. "We don't know that for sure, but every man dropped his tools, snatched up his gun, and rushed for the train. You see how deeply we feel for our Tsar. Only 20 minutes advance notice, and we got this nice big surprise party ready for him. He likes military displays. Well, here it is. Not in regulation style, but quite impressive, is it not?" It was. Never have I seen such a be-weaponed set of men. In their hands were missiles enough to blow 1,000 Tsars into eternity, and in their hearts and eyes vengeance enough to annihilate 10,000. They combed the train from end to end, opening trunks, ransacking beds, even shifting the logs on the engine tender to see if His Imperial Majesty might be hidden in the woodpile. There were two white-bearded peasants who would run their guns under each train car, ram their bayonets around, and then withdraw them, shaking their heads sadly. The Tsar of all the Russias they hoped to find riding the bumpers. Each time disappointed, they would hope for better luck at the next train car and repeat the proddings. But there was no Tsar, and so their bayonets did not puncture him. Farewell, Tsarskoye Selo. How does one choose among the belongings of a lifetime? In his study, Nicholas sorted through his papers. Some he destroyed, others he locked in a file cabinet, taking the key into exile with him. And still others, all 50 of his diaries, as well as the over 600 letters Alexandra had written to him since their courtship, went into 2 crates marked AF for Alexandra Fyodorovna and N.A. Nicholas Alexandrovich. In her dressing room, Alexandra emptied the contents of her closets onto the floor. Then she picked through the huge mound of clothing, making 2 piles. Into the smallest one went the items she was taking along. The other, much larger pile would be donated to war victims. Afterward, she packed her family photographs, prayer books, and icon collection. Unlike Nicholas, she had no diaries or letters to pack. She had burned these during the tense days just before Nicholas's abdication. Overhead, the children bustled about. Along with their clothes, the girls packed books, art supplies, photograph albums, and their Brownie box cameras. Alexei added his tin soldiers, a chessboard, and his toy gun. Even the army cots with their thin mattresses and satin comforters would be folded up and taken along. August 13th, 1917 was their last day at Tsarskoye Selo. While Alexandra did some last-minute packing, the children drifted through the palace for the final time. Already the rooms felt empty, the dust-cloth-covered furniture looking like forlorn ghosts. They rowed across the pond to visit Children's Island one last time and walked between the furrows of the now lush vegetable garden. What shall the future bring for my poor children? Alexandra wondered that day. My heart breaks thinking of them. As ordered, at 5 o'clock that evening, the family gathered in the semicircular hall to wait for word that the train arranged for by Kerensky had arrived at the station. Around them, 50 soldiers grunted and cursed as they moved the family's mountain of luggage. Besides clothing, toys, and personal papers, there were crates of books, rolled-up Turkish rugs, reams of bed linen marked with the imperial crest, silverware, fine porcelain dinner plates, clocks, fragile vases, silver pencils, and velvet cushions. Anything to preserve the appearance of their former luxurious lives. Other necessary items included the Tsar's portable chin-up bar, Alexandra's nursing kit, and the electroshock machine Dr. Botkin used on Alexei's weak leg muscles. There were vials of holy water, boxes of smelling salts, laxatives, morphine, and even a year's supply of bath oil and cologne. But more than luggage accompanied the family. In addition to several courtiers who had chosen to share their exile, the Romanovs went with 2 valets, 6 chambermaids, 10 footmen, 3 cooks, 4 assistant cooks, a clerk, a nurse, a doctor, a barber, a butler, a wine steward, 2 pet spaniels, and a bulldog. Now the Romanovs sat among the detritus of their lives and waited, but as the hours passed with no word of the train, the family grew more and more nervous. Finally, at 11 p.m., Kerensky arrived to take the situation in hand. He found the Grand Duchesses huddled together, weeping copiously, while the Tsar stood at one of the windows stonily smoking cigarette after cigarette. Even the usually stoic Alexandra was affected by the nerve-wracking delay. Sitting in her wheelchair, she wept and worried like any ordinary woman, recalled Kerensky. As the hours continued to pass, Kerensky also grew pale and tense. The train ordered for 1 a.m. did not arrive. It did not come at 2 a.m. either. When 3 a.m. came and went, Kerensky picked up the phone. The problem, he learned, was the rail workers. On strike, they refused to couple the cars together. Kerensky desperately tried to work out a deal with them, but 2 anxious hours passed before the group finally heard cars pull into the driveway. Their train was ready, Kerensky told them. It was time to head to the station. Alexandra, her face ashy white, took Nicholas's arm and walked out the door. Behind them came the children, all 5 of them in tears. Overhead, the sky was a rosy pink, the first rays of sunlight bathing the palace and the park in a golden haze. As the cars pulled away, the family turned and watched until their beloved Tsarskoye Selo faded into the distance. They would never see it again.